So the purpose of this short screencast is to introduce some of the ideas, concepts that we're going to be using in the seminars this week when we come to look at spatial analysis of sports facilities and what that can add to strategic planning and strategic decision making for the provision of sports facilities. So the outline of the session, it's a fairly simple and short screencast, but I'll also mention some of the things that we're going to look at in the seminar coming up this week. So the first thing that we want to do is define catchment areas for sports facilities. So catchment areas really are the areas from which the majority of users of sports facilities will come from. So, we need to define for a sports facility the percentage of our users which might travel from a given distance away from the sports centre. And once we understand catchment areas, we can understand the communities that are being served and communities and areas and populations and customers and users which might fall outside of catchment areas. So obviously, for strategic provision and strategic planning, we're interested in areas which are unserved and areas which are served. But for areas which are unserved, we need to think, well, is there sufficient demand, or is there a sufficient strategic case or a sufficient business case for building facilities in that area to meet any unmet demand? So defining catchment areas is an important thing that we need to do in terms of spatial analysis. So in doing this, we want to look at methods for analysing catchment areas. So we'll look at different research which has been done to try to determine size of catchment areas. And then we'll look at data that can be used to analyse the population within a catchment area. When we move into the seminar this week, we'll start to look at, in some detail, Sport England's facility planning model. And the facility planning model really brings together some of the spatial elements and demand and supply techniques looked at in earlier sessions. And it does this through using GIS technology. GIS stands for Geographic Information Systems. And geographic information systems just allow us to geocode data, i.e., if we can give it a postcode or some kind of reference on a map, we can actually map it. And this allows us to map facilities, it allows us to map users, it allows us to do clever things like produce travel time isochrones, which is looking at the road network, how far will people travel from to actually move to our facility. And it also allows us to do some stuff like run spatial interaction models. And spatial interaction models looks at how facilities, different facilities, competing facilities, exert pulls on customers and where they take customers from, and where a certain facility will stop drawing customers because users are more likely to travel to a nearer or a bigger or a more attractive facility. So we will talk about that in the session, and how the facility planning model allows us to use geographic techniques like spatial interaction models and gravity models to understand how facilities interact and how competing facilities have an impact on the potential visit rates and usage of each other's facilities. But that's in the seminar session that we're going to look at. So what's the context for what we're going to look at today? Well, in the workbook, I've sort of mentioned this already in the introduction, but really the techniques that we've looked at in previous sessions lack a spatial demand to demand analysis. So they tell us how many to provide, but not where. So what we've done is a kind of simple spreadsheet analysis of what's demand and how many visits might that mean in the peak period in a week, and let's look at our facilities and look at their space, the size of those facilities, and work out how many visits they can accommodate during the peak hours. So we're comparing our demand, the total number of visits in the peak period, with our capacity, our supply in the peak period, and saying, have we got too many, too few facilities? Now that's great and that's powerful, but what it doesn't tell us is where to provide these facilities. Now, estate agents and for some businesses, people say that only three things are important: location, location, location. There's a long-running TV program on Channel 4, which has got this title, and what you'll see if you watch that is location is important, but sometimes there are other factors which are important as well. But in terms of what we're looking at today, we're trying to bring a kind of locational, spatial analysis to this to help us understand things better. Okay, so sports facility planning is not just about location, and for some kinds of sports facilities, location is less important than for other kinds of facilities, and we'll talk about this later in this presentation. But techniques which ignore location and don't have a spatial element to it, particularly when you come to thinking about where to build facilities and looking for sites to build facilities, they have a limited use. So, one of the things that is important for us to understand is facility pull and consumer pull. Now, in geography, geographers talk about models called gravity models, and gravity models are used to help us understand where users or visitors to a business, and quite often this is used in retail, but it's also used in the facility planning model for Sport England. It helps us understand where visitors are likely to travel from to visit our facility. Now, when visitors are travelling to a facility, it's seen to exert a kind of gravity pull to them. And the larger a facility and the nearer a facility, the more likely people are to travel further to actually use that facility. The further away a facility is, the smaller it is, the less attractive, the less modern it is, the less likely people are likely to travel to that facility. So that's quite an easy concept to understand. So if we can understand that, we can understand this concept of facility pull. So certain facilities will pull users from a wide distance, a wide area, because of their uniqueness, because of their size, because of their attractiveness. And other facilities which are more run-of-the-mill, which are more easily accessible, consumers and users are far less likely to travel a long distance to use them, and they need to be located in convenient and accessible places for people to use them. So this diagram I'm going to show you tries to explain this. So we've got a diagram with two axes, if you like. We've got facility pull, which is increasing up this axis, yeah? So the further we go up this axis, the higher the degree of facility pull, i.e. the stronger its gravity pull, the more likely it is to pull users from a long distance. People will travel from a long distance away to actually use the facility. Along this second axis, we've got consumer pull, and the further we go along this axis, the more likely we are going to need to locate facilities close to customers in order for them to use those facilities. So consumer pull is more important than facility pull for very local facilities. So if we think about this and we try to categorize them, we can come up with three categories of facilities. So perhaps the best kind of way of thinking about this first category here is there are some in sport, there are some remote or resource-based locations with low accessibility but high attractiveness. So we'll talk about what they might be in a minute. And at the other end of the extreme, we've got consumer-based facilities with high local accessibility. And in the middle, we might have a kind of different kind of facility, which is an optimum-centered location for maximum accessibility. So just thinking about Sheffield and the area around Sheffield, let's try and map onto this diagram some of these kinds of facilities or sports resources, if you like. So if we start over here, we've got a remote resource-based, so natural resource-based location with low accessibility and high attractiveness. So we've got on the edge of the city, which is quite accessible to people in Sheffield, which accounts for the high number of people who actually travel and do sport and physical activity and outdoor recreation there. We've got the Peak District National Park, but we can't actually decide where to locate that. That's a natural geographic feature, which is ideally suited to certain kinds of sport activity like climbing, mountain biking, hiking, rowing, canoeing, sailing on reservoirs and lakes, maybe. So we've got that kind of remote, resource-based location. But because there are so few of these, people are willing to travel because of its uniqueness. People are willing to travel, so that has a strong facility pull. In the middle, we've got larger regional or nationally significant facilities. So we've got the English Institute of Sport, which is, as the name suggests, a nationally significant facility. But it's built close to the M1 motorway, so its location means it's easy to get to for people travelling from out of Sheffield. They can get into the city off the M1 junction at Meadowhall and get to the EAS pretty quickly. And also within Sheffield, it's well connected through the road network and the public transport network, including buses and the tram system. So EIS is well connected, as is Ice Sheffield. So Ice Sheffield is another national facility as well. It's a kind of international ice rink pad. And we could argue so is Ponds Forge with its, Ponds Forge International Sports Centre, to give it its full name. So it is of regional and national significance, but obviously it's located right in the middle of town for kind of maximum accessibility for all people in Sheffield. But it's also located, close to the train station for people travelling into Sheffield from outside for competitions and events and so on. And then the third category we've got are the more local sports centres, local pools, and muggers. If you don't know what muggers are multi-use games areas. So the kind of local five-a-side basketball, multi-goal provision which you see around. So it's kind of, sports equivalent of a playground. And this probably these kinds of facilities exert a lower facility pull. So what we can see here is that a mixed sports centre with a wide range of facility options is higher up this kind of facility pull axis, than a local pool, which is a single type provision with a lower kind of facility pull. And muggers, really exert a much lower facility pull. And when I talk about multi-use games areas, I'm not talking about full-size artificial grass pitches. They would have a similar kind of facility pull and consumer pull relationship as a local sports centre. Multi-use games areas are really those very small kickabout areas, which you probably don't have to book, which are open access, which aren't staffed, and so on. So these kinds of facilities, consumer pull is stronger. So what's more important for them is that they are based with high local accessibility to to serve local community needs. And to be honest, in the way that we've been looking at facility provision in this module, we've been mostly concerned with facilities which exhibit a stronger consumer pull than they do a facility pull. So let's just talk about that and think about that. So quite often we don't talk about this much in this module, but one way of thinking about facility provision is thinking about hierarchies of facilities. So here we have a kind of pyramid, yeah, and the pyramid has got kind of 3 levels. So we could actually relate this to the 3 facility typologies that we had in the previous slide. So we could have things which have a very high facility pull and which are relatively unique. We have ones which have got, which are significant regionally and locally, but we need to think about siting them for maximum convenience for travel. And then we have facilities which need to be located locally. But what we can see as we move up this continuum is that as we move from this kind of community provision up to unique national provision, we can see that these facilities become increasingly strategically significant with far larger catchment areas. So the Peak District catchment area is, takes in much of the Northwest, much of the West Midlands and East Midlands, and much of South Yorkshire and West Yorkshire. So it takes up a huge catchment area. These facilities are far more likely to be accessed by public transport or by car, and in the case of the Peak District, largely by car. They tend to be, and if we're talking about built facilities, they tend to be larger and more expensive to build. So if we're thinking about the national level, we might be thinking about Wembley as the national stadium. We might be thinking about the English Institute of Sport. And they are planned using national data and strategies. So quite often these kinds of facilities are built based on the needs of sport national governing bodies rather than local communities. Okay, so it's kind of how this fits into a sports strategic plan rather than the needs of local communities. Okay, so that's how we define these facilities towards the top end of the hierarchy. And we don't really use the facility planning model, or we don't use demand and supply techniques for this. We look at what are the needs of the sport first, rather than what are the needs of the community. So what network of strategic facilities might a sport like football need in order to succeed? Well, it needs a national stadium. It needs a national St George's Park, but then it might need some kind of regional or local St George's Parks, which fulfill a kind of city or sub-regional need. And then below that, there's kind of, local facilities that meet community needs. But the things at the top of the pyramid are very much determined by national facility priorities, not local facility priorities. And national facility priorities don't really work with demand and supply. It's more about what are the needs of that sport, the technical and the elite development needs of that sport, which isn't really about everyday people participating and how often they participate. Now, as we move down the hierarchy, we can see that these facilities become increasingly locally significant with smaller effective catchment areas. So if the Peak District as a natural resource has a huge catchment area, a swimming pool has a relatively small catchment area. So people in Sheffield would not travel from one side of the city to the opposite side of the city to use a swimming pool. If they had to travel that far and there were no other options, they might not swim at all. They might decide to use their time to do something else. So swimming pools, we will look and see, have got much smaller catchment areas than something like the Peak District or even the English Institute of Sport. As we move down the hierarchy, they're increasingly accessed on foot or by bike. They're smaller and cheaper to build. They are more likely to be planned using local data and views. So this is what we've been looking at in recent weeks. We've been looking at national participation rates, but local population data, and applying this to local needs. Um, so, so that hierarchy is useful for us helping or starting to think about catchment areas and size of catchment areas. So the bigger, the more strategic the facility, the higher the facility pull. The smaller, the more local the facility, the stronger the consumer pull and the smaller the catchment area. Okay, so let's think then about some catchment areas. So all facilities have catchment areas. Schools have catchment areas. Shops have catchment areas. GP surgeries, health clinics, hospitals have catchment areas. So there's this idea that they are the centre. They're almost like the sun at the centre of our solar system, and they exert a gravity pull. Now, the further away you get, the weaker the gravity until you end up in another solar system and you have other planets, and we're talking about planets here like populations that are in the gravity of that particular facility. But once we move beyond the gravitational pull, other facilities, like other solar systems, start to pull in communities. So all facilities have catchment areas. This isn't something that's unique to sport. And facilities are based on this concept of distance decay function, which is the further you travel, the further away you move from a centre, the less likely that people in that area are likely to travel to that centre or that facility. Yeah. So this is very close to the idea of facility pull and consumer pull. So the further away you get from a facility, the less exertion the facility pull has on you. Now, catchment areas for sports facilities are usually defined as the area within which 75% to 80% of users will travel from. And different kinds of facilities, so facilities for different sports, have different sized catchment areas. So we're going to look at some of this in the following slides. And also, importantly, different types or groups of people have different catchment areas. So some parts of the population, or in some communities, we have very high car ownership levels, and that means people are more mobile or more able to travel. And in other areas of a city like Sheffield, there are actually relatively low car ownership levels, and that means significant numbers of people may have mobility issues. And when I say mobility, I don't mean kind of physical mobility, like they need to walk with a stick or they have trouble walking. I mean, they might have problem accessing facilities which are further away because they don't have access to a car and they rely on public transport or walking. So, we need to bear that in mind, and we will bear that in mind and look at how we can try and address that in the seminar this week. So, catchment areas for selected facility types. So, the Sports Council, and this is what Sport England used to be called, so some of this is from an old publication, but the figures still are used in the facility planning model and are used for planning generally. Give some example of effective catchment areas. So this is based on user surveys at facilities over many, many years and many different kinds of facilities, where people are asked, what's your postcode, and a catchment area is mapped, or they are asked, how far have you travelled today, or how long have you travelled here today to use this facility. So here we can see the different catchment areas for different kinds of facilities in different settings, so urban and rural settings. So a lot of you, and many of you, will be looking at purely urban areas. So urban areas, have higher densities of population, which are able to support a higher density of facilities. So travel times are less. If you live in rural areas, you have to accept that you don't have populations which have necessarily the concentrations to merit the provision of many kinds of facilities. So, travelling to facilities, whether that's schools, hospitals, shops, and sports facilities in rural areas, is far more common. So, in rural areas, we find that catchment areas are bigger because people have to travel further to use those facilities. So, we've got swimming pools and golf courses on this slide here. And on this slide here, we've got some data for artificial grass pitch users. And this is from a survey done by Sport Scotland and Sport England, which is called the Synthetic Turf Pitch Study. And so we can see that, really the majority of users, so if we think 70% of users of artificial grass pitches here, if we look at these cells here, travel from within 5 miles. Okay, so just to kind of provide you with some local evidence on this. So when I used to work at Sheffield City Council, we used to do surveys of sports facilities within the city quite regularly. So this is actually an analysis of postcodes of users of Chapeltown swimming pool, which isn't there anymore. Chapeltown swimming pool was closed, and Thorncliffe facility was opened in the north of the city, partially to replace Chapeltown pool. But so this was a small local pool. It was a standalone pool, a kind of old 25-yard pool. And what we can see here is that cumulatively, 71% of users, so the green bar is the number of users coming from, for here, for example, it's less than half a mile, from within half a mile to a mile, and then this is 1 to 2 miles. So what we can see is the green bar is the number of people from that specific travel zone, if you like, and the brown or the kind of burgundy bar is the cumulative. So that is the brown bar here is the number of people or the percentage of people travelling from less than half a mile, added to the number of people travelling between 0.5 and 1 mile. So by the time we get up to 2 miles, the cumulative number is 70%, and by the time we get up to 3 miles, the cumulative percent is over 80%. So, for Chapeltown swimming pool, as an example of a swimming pool within Sheffield, we've got evidence which supports Sport England's suggestion that an effective catchment area for a swimming pool is 2 miles. And what we can see if we look at Chapeltown is 70 to 80% of users come from within 2 to 3 miles. Okay, but also there's a significant proportion of people in Sheffield coming, so just over half of users actually coming from within 1 mile. Okay, so that is pretty much all I wanted to talk to you about. So we've introduced the concept of catchment areas, and I just want to close this screencast by thinking about how we might use this in the seminars. So in the seminars, you're going to be using some of this information and postcode data from your supply tables that you produced in last week's seminar using Active Places Power. You're going to use that information on Google Maps to produce simple circular catchment areas around your facilities. And I'm going to suggest to you that for swimming pools, you use catchment areas of 1 miles and 2 miles in urban areas and up to 8 miles in rural areas. For artificial grass pitches, we're going to use a catchment area of 1 mile and 2 miles. We're going to use a similar catchment area for facilities like tennis courts, and for golf courses, we're going to use catchment areas of between 3 and 5 miles. Sports halls and gyms 2 to 3 miles again, and we can talk in the session about any other specific types of facilities which students might be looking at. Okay, so we'll be using that that data, that catchment area data, in the session to help you do the practical task of mapping your facility catchment areas onto your area, and then we'll be looking to see, well, are there any unserved areas? Are there areas where there's lots of facilities serving the same area, and strategically, is that a good thing to do? Are there arguments for or against that kind of provision? So we'll use this to help us look at facility options. We could also look at, well, what happens to areas served or unserved if we close facilities. So, for example, if we know we have an old swimming pool and we take that off the map because we think we might close that in the next 10 years, then what does that do about the pattern of provision? Are there unserved areas? Okay, so there are some things that we can look at using these maps which help us start to address some significant strategic questions. What we will do in finishing off the session is we will consider Sport England's facility planning model refinements and look at how that allows us to ask and answer with more certainty some more sophisticated strategic questions. Okay, so that's the end of this screencast, and we'll pick up a lot of these things in the seminar this week. Thank you.